Okay, so today we have the first part of a two-part session on water conflict. So the first part is a lecture which is called, as you can see on the board, Theoretical Issues and Approaches. And the second part will be much more practical, where in a seminar form of class you're going to get to discuss what do these theoretical issues and approaches mean when you apply them to a case that you are working on. So, to get us started, there are three purposes of this lecture. The first purpose is to give you an overview of major themes and frameworks that surround the ideas of water conflict. The second purpose is to prepare you for the second part of the class, so for water conflict 2, so that you can actually be able to apply some of these frameworks to case study analysis. And the third purpose of the lecture is to give you some guidance in terms of how you're framing your research project. Now, the structure of the lecture is very simple. It has three parts. In the first part, what we're going to discuss is 5 pairs of key concepts. So, 5 pairs of key concepts grouped together 2 by 2. We're going to talk about the differences between them. Can you distinguish between them? Why do we need to distinguish between them? The second part of the lecture is going to introduce you to 5 types of theoretical approaches towards water conflict, and hopefully there are things that you can apply also to your research and look at case studies or look at empirical evidence from different angles. And the third part of the lecture is 5 practical considerations that usually diplomats or company owners take into consideration when they're dealing with water conflict, thinking about water conflict, and clearly they also apply to local communities because they affect them, perhaps local civil society that wants to take a position, NGOs, etc. So, let's get into it. The first part of the lecture is focused on introducing 5 pairs of key concepts. So, the first pair of key concepts is, what is the source of conflict that we were talking about? Is it actually the water scarcity? So is it a nature-based source of conflict, or is it actually people and their actions and intentions? So the way that I'm going to introduce that to you is also through a very brief historical introduction to water conflict. So, as you know, civilization started with water, because life needs water to survive. And also the big cities, if you think about them, they're always built around rivers. So the earliest form of recorded history actually came from Mesopotamia and from the Sumerians. So Mesopotamia, this region in the Middle East, what it literally means is between 2 rivers. So Mesos in ancient Greek means between, and Potamos in ancient Greek means river. So the 2 rivers here, the Euphrates and the Tigris that you can see here, are what shaped the region of Mesopotamia to start with. And in this very long recorded history, the longest recorded human history, what we can see is water conflicts that used to happen thousands. So you had Umma and Lagash. And as you can see, the water first passes through Umma and then goes downstream towards Lagash. So there were channels that moved from the river towards Lagash. So Umma could control the flow of water towards Lagash. As you can perhaps imagine, this was often a source of conflict, because if the water stops towards Lagash, then you have everything stopping. So I'm not just talking about drinkable water, potable water that you need for people to sustain their lives. I'm also talking about things like agriculture. So agriculture is one of the main sectors that needs water to keep going up until today. The majority of water we use is for agriculture, in fact. The other thing that would stop is trade. So also water back then was something that people would use for transport. Of course, we use it, we use it less so for transport now, but even if you think about ocean transport, it's also something that we use very, very much. So this ancient conflict of upstream and downstream control of water is something that seems to have stuck with us for thousands of years. So when you look at that type of situation and this type of conflict repeating itself over thousands of years, naturally the question to ask is, a lot of these water conflicts, are they starting because there are some sort of natural constraints, or because there is a problem with the quantity of water, or are they starting because there is a problem with the way that people are using the water? So this is the first contradiction that I want to propose to you to consider. If you look at the history of water conflict in detail, there are people like Dr. Peter Glick from the Pacific Institute that have worked to create actually historiographies, chronologies of water conflict through the years. So you can go and find it online, and you can find records of, well, historical records of all of the water conflicts that happened throughout the years, from ancient times through the Middle Ages until today. So, one other thing that you can think about in these terms is whether things have changed from the past into the present, or whether we have actually maintained the same types of conflicts and attitudes, but we're just transferring them into a different period of time. And again, these are questions that you can answer either way. You can answer them, well, however you would like to argue. I don't want to give you ideas yet. So the first contradiction is between two potential sources of conflict: natural scarcity and also people's actions and desires. The second type of distinction that I want to propose to you is between water and oil. So if you read the media specifically, there are plenty of sensationalist titles, like you can see the one up there on the board by the Financial Times labeling water the new oil. You can see also other analysts that are a bit more insightful, like futurists who have considered the idea that water is actually more important than oil. But either way, what I want to propose to you is the idea of considering whether there is a parallel between the two, why so and how so. So this is not something that can easily be assumed, because if you think about, well, why is there no parallel? For instance, there are plenty of factors. Well, water is essential for life, oil isn't. Well, the distribution of water is much more dispersed than the distribution of oil. So you don't have a small number of water exporting countries for the whole world. Well, water is renewable, unlike oil. So it circulates all the time. So when people talk about water scarcity, that's also something that you can consider. Is water really scarce in general, on average, or are there other problems? Also, you have the idea of water depletion versus, for example, oil depletion. Well, if a region gets depleted of oil, what happens to the environment? Well, not that much necessarily, because it's already been damaged enough, but that's pretty much as damaged as it gets. Whereas if it gets depleted of water, well, if you look at, for instance, the expansion of the desert in sub-Saharan Africa, what happens is the desert grows and it kills life on the way as it grows. So there are plenty of reasons why you can claim that water is in no way similar to oil. But then you can also flip the argument, and you can make the same types of parallels between water and different types of natural resources. Well, there are natural resources, so they're one type of good. And there are also things that we use, for instance, in the case of oil, for making energy. And there are also potentially things that we might be fighting for, depending on how you interpret the idea of water conflict. So the second distinction that I want to propose to you is water and oil, or water and other natural resources. Are there parallels? Why are there parallels, or aren't there parallels? And again, why not? Either way, be cautious when you're making claims of any sort related to that. Now, the third distinction that I want to propose to you is between concepts such as war and conflict. So I want to start with war, because that's one of the most central concepts of the study of the social in general. Definitely, war and peace is the bread and butter of international relations. So if you think about war, this is a concept that's had many definitions throughout the years. So perhaps the most classic work on war, it's called by General Clausewitz, defines war as an act of violence for the purpose of compelling the enemy to do what we will. Well, if you look at definitions like this, which come from somebody with a military background, what you're looking at is a desire to impose your will and your power. But then also, is this a definition that is suitable for research, or is it too general? based on this definition, can you identify what is a war and what is not a war? Well, it seems to me that it's fairly hard to do that. So there are plenty of scholars who have criticized this definition for being too general. You also have other definitions that came later in the 20th century. For instance, armed conflict between population groups conceived of as organic unities such as races or tribes, states or lesser geographic units, religious or political parties, economic classes. Well, this definition clearly seems to be very broadly sociological. So it's conceiving war as conflicts between various groups of people, whether they be states or people of different economic classes, etc. So if you look at another angle, for instance, mass or total war may be defined as a type of armed conflict between large nation states. So pay attention to the word nation states. Is war a conflict between states? Or can there be other types of war? If you define war as conflict between states, then is civil war war indeed? Or are local conflicts war? Or are conflicts between tribes in the context of war? So what is actually war? Does it have to be between nation states? So the way that I think of war conceptually, and obviously you don't have to agree with me, is you need to have at least 4 characteristics for something to be considered a war. The first one is it needs to be led in an organized manner. So it is not disorganized. You do have, for instance, armies that have hierarchies that are there, they're structured, and they're fighting each other in an organized manner. The second point is it has to be armed. So if you have people that are fighting with their bare hands, this is not war, at least by my definition, and you can disagree with me, of course. The third point is that it must be violent, so there must be a certain sort of aggression and violence that goes with it. And the fourth point is that they must have some sort of a collective purpose defined in opposition to the enemy. So first of all, they must be united in some form, and second of all, they must be united to defeat the enemy for a certain common purpose. Well, of course, this is a definition that you might or might not adopt or agree with, but it's another angle of looking at things potentially. If you are in the field of law, are there any legal definitions of war? What counts as a war legally? When do we declare war officially? In terms of international law, how is that defined? Well, all of these definitions so far, they've been very much conceptual. Now, if you think of doing actual research, then all of this is not that helpful if you're dealing with empirical data. So projects like the Correlates of War, which is a big project that contains data for many wars throughout the years in history, defines war differently. Defines war as sustained combat involving organized armed forces, resulting in a minimum of 1,000 battle-related fatalities, so a minimum of 1,000 deaths within a 12-month period. So why is this definition so time-specific and so specific to numbers? Well, because it's meant for a research project. Okay, so that allows the researcher to define their scope in some way. So when you're thinking about war, definitely consider what is the purpose of the definition that you are giving. If you give a general definition, can you define your research scope? If you give a general definition, then do you know which ones are water wars and which ones are water conflicts? So this is a point for you to definitely consider. And how do you measure war as well? Do you measure the size or the scale of war? Is it important? Do you measure the preparation that goes in, whether it's organized, whether it's legitimate? At what point is war legitimate, if any? So based on this huge discussion of war, of course, the takeaway for you is to consider how do you understand war and which are the cases that you will include in analysis of war, if any. So war is, of course, different from other similar concepts like crisis and conflict. So if you look at what is generally taken to be a much lighter form, well, perhaps the lightest, well, depends on how you define them really, but definitely much lighter than war. If you think of crisis, how does it emerge and how does it escalate? So how does this tension escalate and why? What preconditions do you need to have a crisis? So generally, many scholars believe that you need some sort of a pressure or a threat And you also need to have limited time for response, because this creates the urgency and the tension. So something is coming unless you respond, and this creates a sense of crisis. So when do you have water crisis? Is also a question for you to consider. And when you think of conflict as well, conflict seems to be one of the seems to be the broadest term out of these three for defining some sort of opposition here. So conflict is overt, coercive interactions of contending collectivities, at least according to Gert's definition. So does this include war? Does conflict include war? Or must a war have an element of conflict? Or are they completely separate? How do you conceptualize them in terms of understanding the cases that you are analyzing? So when you think about conflict and war, also keep in mind the following. So international relations as a discipline, it started in 1919, and it started in the interwar period, but really began to develop very rapidly after 1945. And one of the reasons international relations developed was, well, we wanted to find ways in which to mitigate conflict and to solve problems like rising states and falling states and maintaining balance of power. So in that context, international relations was very state-centric for the majority of the 20th century. That means that it dealt with the relations between states as opposed to communities or domestic politics or tribes or anything like that. So as we are moving further away from World War II, well, one of the things that's happening is people are starting really to forget about war at large. So what they are starting to include in the field of international relations is other types of conflict. So if you look at the trend in general, what's happened is IR has moved from being a state-centric, war-centric discipline in terms of research focus to something that's also considering very much other types of conflict now, and there are different approaches emerging to do that. So when you look at different types of crises or conflict or war, this is also something that you need to be able to distinguish clearly in the cases that you're discussing. So if you're talking about crisis, is this a diplomatic crisis? Is this an environmental crisis? So that relates back to the first distinction that we made of conflict between conflict caused by the actions of people and conflict caused by something that is a natural shortage of vital resources. If you think of types of conflict, is this a violent conflict or is this a non-violent conflict? Is this an armed conflict or an unarmed conflict? Is it domestic or is it international? So this changes the whole perspective, because if you think of international conflict, then it falls very much within the field of mainstream international relations, where you consider relations between states. If it's a domestic conflict, it falls conceptually into a separate field. So you might be leaning on different literature to seek for frameworks to interpret your case studies, for example. If you think of war, it's also not very easy to understand what exactly type of war you're dealing with. So are you dealing with civil war or war between states? And when you look at places where the borders are very much blurred, like the borders in Africa, where you have a lot of armed groups that are really controlling territory and they're not marked on the map. Well, where does the actual state start and stop? Is this a conflict between just private armed groups, or is this a conflict between states? If you look at conventional versus unconventional war, that's also another distinction that you need to be able to make. In any case, the point is, when you think of water conflict, water crisis, water war, what types of crises, wars, and conflicts are you thinking about? You should be able to distinguish these very clearly. So, distinction number 4 is conflicts and wars about water. So, they're states or communities fighting for the water in some form, or because of the water, versus conflicts or war involving water. So water is an element of the conflict or the war, but this is not why we're fighting, and this is definitely not the central thing. around what we're doing here. So if you look at causes of conflict or war, one very useful typology, although it's been forgotten by many people, I believe, in international relations, is what Rummel put forward in 1978. So he identifies 5 types of causes for war or conflict. The first type is a necessary cause. So this is something without which the conflict would not occur. So if you think about water as a factor in conflict, in the specific conflict that you're looking at, if you did not have water, would it not occur? Was it a necessary cause for the conflict? Was it, well, the second type of conflict is a sufficient cause. So a cause that itself produces conflict. So for instance, in international relations, one of the causes that is taken to be sufficient is a change in the balance of power. So if you have one state rising and one state falling, this is thought to be something which naturally produces conflict regardless of the international situation and regardless of the time period that you're in. And you know, you can even think of the current debates of China's rise and potentially the US's decline. This is one of the reasons why international scholars tend to be slightly worried, especially if they're realists, because they're thinking that this is naturally going to produce conflict, regardless of anything else that's going on. The third type of cause for conflict or war is aggravating conditions. So something that makes a conflict escalation more likely. So it's not necessarily something which is sufficient or necessary, but it just makes it more likely. So in many of the places where you have water conflict and water issues are these places where you've had some sort of issues already, and water just makes it more likely for the conflict to emerge. The fourth type of cause is inhibiting conditions. So this is the opposite of aggravating conditions, something that makes a conflict less likely. So for instance, if we have a certain body of water without which both of us would potentially have serious trouble, then are we more likely to actually cooperate and agree on how we use it, because otherwise we both get into big trouble as governments or as ruling entities. So can water be an inhibiting condition? Can it make conflict less likely in certain situations? And the fifth type of cause is a trigger cause. So an event which provokes one or both parties to action. So if you think of the way that conflict around war have been going on, and if you think about the way that strategists have conceived water, you can find very interesting examples. For instance, in that database of Peter Glick that I spoke to you about before. So at the beginning of the Renaissance, you had people like Machiavelli, the Italian strategist, and Leonardo, who were planning to stop the access to water of other places in Italy, of other cities, as a strategy. So was this something that would have been a conflict about water, or was this just a way of using water in a conflict? So was this a conflict involving potentially water? Well, they never succeeded because the engineers were well, not that good at the time, and they failed with the project. But that's another story. So if you think about the conflicts in the Middle East, according to UNESCO, water seems to cause conflict in the Middle East. Well, I'm not so sure that it's the sole cause of conflicts there. Are these societies where you already have plenty of other issues going on in terms of religion, borders, ideology, in terms of a region that does not have one single state that's leading the whole region, and there is a certain element of anarchy between states who are fairly balanced in terms of their capabilities, and they can fight actually. So that's the fourth distinction: conflict about water versus conflict involving water, and that can shape your entire research framework, in fact, because it depends on how you frame your definition. You might actually conclude that there are no conflicts about water at all in world history, depending on how you frame your conceptual understanding of things. Now, the fifth distinction is between water access and water quantity in general. So I've read a tremendous number of articles and reports and student essays for that matter that start with the sentence, well, only 2.5% of Earth's water is fresh water. This means water is very scarce. Well, does it? We've had the same percentage of fresh water for millions of years, and it's been supporting the ecosystem, because that's the percentage of water that the ecosystem seems to need. So how does that mean that water is scarce? I never understood the logic of that statement. It's been baffling me for years, and if somebody can explain it to me in one of your projects, I would be very, very delighted, but I doubt it. So is it a problem with water quantity on average, or is it a problem with access to water and the way that water is distributed around regions? So when people talk about water scarcity, do they mean water scarcity for planet Earth, or do they mean, well, there is a region that doesn't necessarily have access to water in particular for some reason? So there are different concepts here that you can consider and take as starting points for research. You have, of course, water scarcity, which is the fresh water in total, usually within a given area. And you know, when it's insufficient, we call it water scarcity. You have water stress. So when you have projections for demand overseeding supply by a large margin, you seem to have a lot of water stress. You have water risk. So what is the possibility of experiencing a water-related challenge? So these are terms that are used very frequently, but different scholars do not necessarily define them the same way. So if you take something as simple as water scarcity, some scholars would talk about water scarcity in general, and others would talk about a specific area. That's very different. That's night and day. That makes a difference in terms of the whole argument that someone's making. So when you think about water stress, there is something very briefly that I wanted to show you by the Water Resources Institute, and you might have seen it. It's basically a graph of water stress by country. So what they calculate is the ratio of withdrawals, meaning, well, the water that gets taken to supply, and, well, you can see the red regions are potentially under extremely high stress. And it's surprising how much of the world is actually under water stress according to that research. Well, there might be something to do with the methodology. I don't know, but definitely look into it and see what you can make of it. So far we've identified 5 pairs or groups of concepts that you need to be clearly able to distinguish between. The first pair of concepts is thinking about whether nature or people are the true source of water conflict, whether there is a difference between the present and the past in terms of the way that water conflict unfolds. The second pair is water versus oil, or water versus any other type of natural resource. Are you actually able to make a parallel? Why or why not? Is this parallel appropriate? The third one is crisis, conflict, and war. 3 things that are potentially very, very different, and determine the types of case studies that you include and the way that you analyze them. The fourth pair of conflicts is conflicts about water versus conflicts involving water, which is, again, very different. Is there causality here? Can water cause conflict at all? Or is it something that we use strategically, or just gets involved by accident in the conflict because it happens to be there? And fifth, we have water access versus water quantity. What is the problem? Do we not have enough water, or are we not distributing it appropriately? So far, do you have any questions? Good. So let's move to the next part of the talk. The second part of the talk is going to introduce you to 5 types of theoretical approaches that you can use to understand water conflict. Now, bear in mind a couple of things. Well, the first one is that I took the framework for presenting the first three from a very excellent chapter, which you can go and Google later, and it can clarify a few things for you. The second one is that the way that I've grouped these theoretical approaches, these are not the schools of thought within IR. I have regrouped them in ways that are more likely to be appropriate to analyzing water conflict. So if you think of schools in IR, you would have realism, liberalism, post-structuralism, constructivism. I've taken these labels out and grouped them according to labels which I believe are more appropriate. So, theoretical approach number one, considering the material conditions surrounding water conflict. And this is something that would usually be associated with the realist research tradition, and in some ways it might touch on the liberal research tradition in international relations. So there are really four aspects of material conditions that you have to think about. The first one is quantity of water. So water is very interesting in the sense that scarcity is a problem and abundance is a problem. So even if you think of the way that ancient people conceived their myths about water, there are people who would pray for water, and that would be, what they wished for. And then there are also myths about great floods, including the Bible, notably. But before the Bible, 2,000 years before the Bible, the Sumerians had, well, a very similar myth, which very likely shaped the myth in the Bible. Because if you look at ancient texts, in fact, you can notice that there's a lot of parallels between different types of sacred texts. Why they had parallels is another topic. But anyways, let me get back to water conflict before I drift away. So scarcity or abundance, and also within which areas. So quantity, space are key in terms of material conditions. Second question is, well, quality of water. Is water polluted or is it getting polluted? Well, salinity of water, is it fresh or is it ocean water? The third part of material conditions is distribution. So when you think of the realist tradition, realists believe in the nation state fundamentally, and they tend to believe that sovereignty and anarchy, which means that each nation state is basically on its own. So anarchy means there's no 911 in international relations. If there's a problem that happens, well, you're going to deal with it because you're a nation state, and maybe nobody's going to come and help you. So based on that concept, realists would often focus on bilateral state-to-state relations in the way that conflict gets shaped and in the way that conflict potentially gets solved. Whereas liberals, or liberal institutionalists rather, would focus on the role of institutions in terms of cooperation, or institutions in terms of why or something, but why or for what reason something is failing. The fourth aspect of material conditions is uses of water. Well, because conflict stems from competition for using it, hence why you need to consider why people actually need it. And clearly, well, if you haven't seen the numbers, I'm telling you that we're using water primarily for agriculture. We also use it a lot in industry. So if we decrease the amount of water that we use in agriculture, can we actually solve the world's problems? It's another question that you can consider from a purely materialistic perspective. So the second type of perspective is the opposite to the mainstream perspective. So materialist considerations were very much mainstream. The second type is very much critical. And it has to do with power relations. Now, the idea of power, in fact, is one of the most complicated and fascinating concepts in international relations and in human relations for that matter. So I'm not going to get into it. But when you talk about power relations, you usually talk about things like, well, the unequal distribution of income and material resources that is at the basis of conflict, instability, and the denial of difference and equality. So we're talking about unequal distributions of resources. We're talking about these factors causing a conflict. And scholars that are into research in power relations would very much deal with things like colonial history, so that would be post-colonial scholars, or scholars from political economy, so that would come from something like the Marxian tradition. So they would focus on the sources of conflict as rooted in history. So resource extraction, mercantilism, capitalism, are these the actual reasons why we have water conflict? Because these phenomena create power relations. So this is a fundamentally different explanation to the idea that negotiations between states fail in terms of institution. This would tell you, well, listen, you have history that's created these great forces that have led us to have water conflict, and it would perhaps happen regardless of how you manage institutions. So when you think of critical relations and power relations, Zeitun and Warner have the idea of Hydra Hegemony, and more specifically what that means is, well, they believe there are three strategies that states use to establish water control. Now, the first strategy is resource capture. So that would be states ensuring that they have property rights, or that would be companies ensuring that they have property rights. So who has the right to build a large-scale project around water, or to use the water from a river, or to build a dam, or to do something like that. So that would be a form of capturing resources. The second strategy is containment. So if you have a stronger and a weaker actor cases, well, states or companies or whatever the actors might be, the stronger actor might exert pressure on the weaker one and influence them to act towards compliance. So this is making someone or some form of state or society to comply because you're threatening them and pressuring them. Now, containment is very different from integration. So it's basically the opposite of integration, which is the third strategy. Well, integration is when a hegemon seeks to incite compliance with incentives. So are states creating incentives for other states to agree to their terms? So are you offering them something in return? I'll use this this piece of water, but then we can do some beneficial trade, or I will offer you protection in advance, or what kind of incentives can states offer in advance. So think of power relations as a framework. The third framework for understanding water conflict, the third type of frameworks for understanding water conflict is securitization, and it gets associated with the Copenhagen School. So after the 1980s, what happened within IR, as I mentioned to you, was it started shifting from a focus on war onto all types of conflict. And alongside that trend, what it also started considering is non-military threats. So clearly, things like climate change and things like water scarcity are not fundamentally military threats. They are, well, what some would argue, natural threats. But in any case, this gets involved into politics. So securitization is the process of labeling a concept as essential for survival through speech. So what these types of scholars would say is, well, water becomes essential to conflict when politicians start talking about water as something essential. Unless they do, it is not really essential yet. So it talks about speech and language is something that's crucial to securitizing water. Well, another idea to consider here is it something quote unquote good to securitize water? So does it help resolve conflict when we all believe it's something that's a part of the security realm? Or does it increase the probability of conflict when we actually mix water and military affairs or water and politics? Because obviously you have situations where if something is considered as too dangerous, such as, well, the US and the USSR before 1990 having nuclear weapons, then what you had is basically a stalemate where nobody would use them. So if water gets considered as something that is essential, is this a way of actually securitizing water because nobody's going to dare to touch it? Or is it the opposite? Are we going to actually start fighting about it because we included it in the discourse of military and security of the nation state? So when you had the rise of the security-related discourse around water, obviously a lot of ideas surrounding the nation state and water scarcity started to emerge, including ideas of water being used as targets by terrorist groups. So in this type of research approach, what you would use is primarily discourse analysis. Why? Because it takes language as the fundamental matter of what is securitized and what is not. So analyzing language would be something very different from analyzing, for instance, material conditions, if you're using an approach that's based on material conditions, like the one we spoke about. Now, the fourth type of theoretical frameworks are negotiation and law-oriented theoretical frameworks. Well, when you think of negotiation, it is something that, in theory, must always be positive sum in order to succeed. So the result must always be, in total, a sum that's greater than what the actors would otherwise get. Now, there are also psychological aspects to international relations, and you have political psychology. So, if someone is coming to negotiate with me on water, is this because they genuinely want to negotiate, or is this a strategy on their part, and they have something else in mind? They want to misdirect my attention to the negotiations while they prepare to attack and to take over. You've had, of course, classical works from the past century, like Perception, Misperception, International Politics, that you can look at on your own. So you have also other considerations like having to ensure that no parties are being forced to the negotiating table, because in that case negotiations would likely fail. The other element of consideration in negotiations is how do they relate to great powers in general. So if there are great powers backing one of the sides, for instance, or both of the sides, is the negotiation more likely to succeed, and are they more likely to stay true to their word because the Americans are behind them or because the Americans are against them, for instance? Now, when you think about international law, well, first of all, you have to think whether international law is law to start with. So is it enforceable? All of these treaties that often feature in many of the projects that we have around here, are they actually enforceable in any way? And if they're not, well, then why do states comply with them? So what is the cost for a state of not complying with the treaty? Perhaps it's the way that it's going to get perceived in the international community. Perhaps it's the way that others are going to start treating that state. A loss of status. Or perhaps it's something else. Or perhaps, as Finmore and Siging are suggesting, there are norms. We are a community of states in which norms are starting to emerge, in the same way that in a society between ourselves, if we spend enough time together, we're going to start to have some form of norms between us just by coexisting over time. So why do states comply, and do they comply at all? And how can you understand or not understand water conflict by looking at treaties and negotiations? Now, the fifth theoretical point here is thinking about science and politics. Are science and politics something that is closely related or no? And it's very much a theoretical point, because it has to do with the idea of how is knowledge produced, and how is data and how are facts produced, and what are they used for and by who. So even if you think of very recent examples that is not directly related to water conflict, but I put it here because it illustrates the point very easily. What is happening on climate change at the moment? Is Trump going with or against climate change? Any idea? Is the US going with or against climate change with Trump?
Against.
So they have this idea that they would like to, well, they don't believe anymore in climate change, right? So you have at the same time, so from the US perspective, you have a trend where they used to say, well, we believe in it, we want to be a part of fighting it, and now we don't believe in it anymore. You have the exact opposite position from China. 15 years ago, when China was mass producing and being industrialized, they didn't like climate change very much, for clear reasons. And now they seem to love climate change. Now there's plenty of research, there's plenty of people getting sent to the UN, there's plenty of talk about climate change, and a green environment has been featured in versions of the so-called China model, if there is one at all, although there are many propositions of one. But there is this tremendous reversal on stances. So in 15 years, did the science change, really? Or did politics change? And how did it change? So is science and politics something that is deeply interconnected, and in what way? So when you think of domestic politics, a lot of the things that surround you are actually results of the connections between science and politics. So what happens with tobacco and smoking? Why was it popular 50 years ago in the US or 60 years ago in the US? Why did nobody say, well, it's very bad for your health? Why is it not popular now? Well, it might still be popular in some places, but why is there this declining trend? For instance, in the US. In other places, the trend is reversed. So anyway, I mean, who and why decides to stick on every box of cigarettes an image that says, cigarettes kill you, you're going to get cancer? I mean, at what point did that become a part of politics? And to what extent was it a part of science only? The same thing with food and drug regulations. Who decides what is safe? When you look at especially big scandals around things like meat import, well, whenever a country starts to not benefit anymore from having a particular type of meat being imported, they can easily come up with, well, very scientifically sound explanations why this type of meat is not particularly healthy anymore. Well, how was it healthy last week, but it's not healthy anymore? So, what is the relationship between scientific explanations and politics? The space race, very obviously, is something that used to drive great domestic support in both the US and the USSR, and now it's something that gets featured in also India and China in terms of space ambitions. Anyways, so when you think of even the production of science and how do scientists get funded, well, it's very often the government that funds scientific projects. So there are, of course, interest groups that interfere in the process. To what extent is science independently developing of politics, or is science a part of politics? Or is science driving politics? Or is politics driving science? In any case, this is something that you can definitely consider in terms of how it relates to water conflict, because who and why decides to tell us, well, that war is a problem, or where war is a problem, or why war is a problem? And how does it have to do with politics? Now, when you think about politicizing water, of course, we've had people claiming that, well, water is politics, quote unquote, literally. You've had the idea of hydropolitics, so the allocation of values with respect to water in society. So, is water something that we have to deal with in terms of science, or is this something that has fundamentally to do with our values as humans and what we believe in and who shapes our beliefs? Now, the majority of studies on water conflict have come from people that are not in international politics, which is actually fascinating. Even when I was making that lecture initially, because I work in international relations, and I sat down and scratched my head, and it's been a very long time since I heard a debate about water conflict within international relations. It's something that gets strangely neglected, and it's something that people from geography or people from environmental science tend to pay a lot more attention to, very interestingly. Now, they don't look at things through the theoretical perspectives of international relations. So there is really a bit of a gap there that can get filled up, for sure. So the 5 theoretical approaches that I wanted to point out to you were number one, material conditions in analyzing water conflict purely through the material aspects of it. Secondly, power relations, exerting pressure of one actor to the other or creating incentive for one actor to cooperate or doing things like that. Securitization, so how and when did the idea of water become a part of the narrative of politics in general? Number three. And then you have number four, negotiation and international law. Are these treaties enforceable? How so? Why so? Why do states comply or why don't they comply? What are the benefits and drawbacks from a state's perspective to comply with them or not to comply with them? And finally, number five, science and politics. What is the relationship between the two, and when and how did scientific considerations of water enter the realm of politics, and how so? So the third and final section of the talk has to do with 5 practical considerations that various actors have to work within when they are dealing with different forms of water conflict. So first of all, when you think about the playing field, when you're trying to solve some sort of a water conflict, you have to think of a multiplicity of actors. So first of all, you have the international level, the national level, and the local level. And second of all, you have civil actors, public actors that have to do with the nation state and organizations, and private actors like companies, businesses. So all in all, that simple table itself makes up for 9 types of actors, and as you can probably imagine, all of them have different types of interests and they're pulling in different directions. So you're talking about the big clash of interests every time you're dealing with water conflict in practice. So all of these theoretical approaches do not necessarily reflect the reality of what you have to do day in, day out to solve water conflict. On top of these 9 types of actors, you also have, for instance, local communities. So you might have communities that have certain religious conflicts, and that's not even anywhere in the table, but these might be a large part of how you decide to approach the problem. Or you might have academics that are very vocal, and that might go on TV or on social media and voice their opinions very loudly. So how do you deal with that? So in any case, dealing with water conflict in practice, or for that matter with any type of conflict, but here it's particularly interesting because it's literally at all levels, is a huge clash of interests. So when you are thinking from the perspective of the one that governs, how do you manage risk? Well, there have been efforts, for instance, at the global level to develop a technical framework for water scarcity and risk assessment. And definitely if you're a politician, you might call in a team of engineers or something like that to come and evaluate the remaining, the quantity of water that you can take from a certain source or do things like that. But here is the fundamental problem. Is risk management something to be decided by scientists or something to be decided by politicians? Well, it's great that scientists are calculating it, but if something happens and if the decision goes wrong, the person that loses their job is the politician. So who ultimately takes the responsibility for making these decisions? And to what extent do politicians care what the scientific reports are? Because at the end of the day, scientists can be very insightful in their calculations, but politicians have certain pressure groups and actors that they have to balance between. So when you think about cities, you have problems, for instance, like should they increase their reserves? So all cities have a certain amount of reserves of water, and if you reach day 0, when you run out of water, they can only last for so long without additional supplies. So who decides whether you should increase your reserves? If you think about agriculture versus importing food, this is actually, this is a point that really reveals how important political considerations are when you talk about water conflict. So because the majority of water is used for agriculture, you have an obvious answer how to solve water scarcity problem within an area. Stop growing crops and import food. It's obvious. And then you're going to have more than enough water. Well, what's the problem? If you start importing fundamental crops to your economy, well, then you become dependent on other states. So if you believe that food import is something that would make you very, very insecure as a country or a society, then you might not want to import crops, and you might continue to use up most of your water to grow crops at the risk of reaching day zero or a point of water scarcity. So, is water a national security issue? Well, you have other scientific solutions here, like planting more water efficient crops or using efficient irrigation methods. So clearly, instead of flood irrigation, instead of filling up fields with water, you can use methods like drip irrigation, where water literally drips, and that uses up a lot less water. So if you look at places like California, they're very efficient in the way that they use water with drip irrigation. There are clear scientific recommendations, but they are not implemented in many places. Why? This is one of the questions that I will be asking you later to discuss. So, first type of considerations, risk management. Who manages the risk, and what do they take into consideration when they do? Second type of consideration, well, there's lots of talk on water diplomacy. Well, first of all, what is water diplomacy? This is something that needs to be defined. How is it different from regular diplomacy? Is it different from regular diplomacy? Well, there are many drivers for an incentive to negotiate over water and to be diplomatic. Clearly, because water is a systemic factor, so then you would have, well, all types of social problems, economic problems, etc. Now, when you're dealing with diplomacy, you have a lot of factors to consider. For instance, the history between the countries, where you have certain tensions or conflict. So, if you have a country that you have not trusted in the past, would you start trusting it suddenly? You consider the time that it's going to take for you to initiate and complete the process. So diplomacy is not corporate deals. Diplomacy is very much old-fashioned in many ways. So you have certain stages that you go through. You have trust building. So you can't decide this week that you will sign a treaty next week. What you will do is you will organize a series of activities focused on trust building. So there are various actor groups also that interfere with diplomacy. So you do have state actors, but you also have international organizations. You have NGOs, you have academia, you have think tanks, you have water-related organizations, and you have religious groups. Well, all these actors are clearly something that you have to consider, and that becomes very difficult to manage in the way of producing decisions that satisfy them sufficiently. Or is the purpose to satisfy them sufficiently? That's another question. Or would you just stomp onto some of them? If you think that NGO is not really helping my strategy, would you just throw them out? So what are the purposes of water diplomacy? Well, it's not just conflict prevention, but it's also resource management in general. And it's also, because it's diplomacy, improving foreign relations. So you have to also consider the aspect of including international politics and the strategy of a certain state when you're talking about diplomacy. The third practical consideration that comes into play is potential human costs. So the UN Convention, well, the UN Convention identifies a lot of elements that should be basic rights to each human. The reality is that, well, more than often, some of them are not. And drinking water is technically, according to the UN, essential to the full enjoyment of life and all other human rights. But when you have a water conflict, or when you have water scarcity, rather even, who pays the price? What type of people actually bear the human costs? Well, if you look at specific case studies like Wittensburg on Kenya, what you figure out is a lot of things that are not necessarily something people would assume. So, first of all, there is a trend there in terms of domestic or local conflicts correlating with the fluctuation in water availability. So you can assume in some way that there is a relationship in terms of water in these conflicts, whatever the relationship is. Now, there are at least a couple of points that are rather surprising to people that look at these studies for the first time at least. So first of all, the people that initiate conflict or looting, because in that case you have a rather wild area of the country where you have groups that just go around and primarily deal with looting and taking whatever they can, including cattle from locals. These are not the people who do not have water. The people that go into violent conflict are not the poorest people that do not have any water. Because if they don't have water, well, they're probably so poor that they don't really have much. They probably don't have anything apart from water either. So how are they going to go into conflict if they don't have anything? The people that initiate the conflict are usually groups that have some sort of resources, and they might be armed in some cases. So if you have weapons, then perhaps you also have a way to get water. But instead, what they would choose to do is to use weapons and initiate a conflict. Why? Well, because it's easy. You go there, you take whatever you can, and you go. Much easier than working. And also, what are the opportunities for them to work? Can they actually work? Who provides them with opportunities? Who provides them with education to start with and to be qualified to work at jobs that pay them decently? The other surprising point is that reporting there is rarely full. So we don't really know what the human costs are in many of these places. So journalists do not necessarily visit them, and there are certain seasons when they don't like to visit them. So very often, when anthropologists go there, they hear about plenty of conflicts that never got reported in the press. So we don't always know the human costs of water-related conflict. And it's something that should perhaps be more in consideration when you're talking about the topic. The fourth type of practical considerations has to do with corporate interests. So you have a whole lot of issues here. I'll just mention some of them, but you can go and look at the papers of Hall and Lobina. They've been dealing with the topic for about at least 15 years, perhaps 20 years now. So they've listed all of them. But a few of these issues are, for instance, corruption. So there was an issue with a mayor election, with mayor elections in a few places in France where companies would go there and support the campaigns of certain mayors in exchange for access to local water resources. And that was a corrupt practice, and some of the candidates for mayors got jailed for that. But anyway, this is something that happens frequently when you talk about natural resources, including in developed Western countries. The other practice of build, operate, transfer is something that has to do with concessions, essentially. So companies might go there and build a water supply reservoir. So for a government, building a supply reservoir is fairly expensive, but it's something that would be very useful. But then if you're a company and you go and build a reservoir for a certain country, what you ask for in return is usually to use the water resources for an extended period of time. So that becomes a concession on that water source for 15 years or 20 years to come. Now, is this something that contributes to the scarcity of water and problems with water in certain areas? Well, this is something that you can explore further. Also, clearly you have interest groups, even domestically, like local farmers or local factory owners that have certain ways of lobbying within the government. You have bottled water, which is now an entire industry. So, if we suddenly fix all the water problems, then how are they going to make money? Anyway, so these are just simple examples, but there is a very long list of these types of issues that certainly contribute to conflict and are relevant to the area. The fifth type of practical considerations is water a source of conflict or a source of cooperation? Now, what's very interesting is when you actually ask people who work on the topic, and there's not that many of them in international relations. At King's College, there is a department of war studies. There's also many researchers on water conflict. And last year they came up with a collective statement that they published. It was called On Water Wars, opinion article by a collective of authors. And what they claimed really was, well, first of all, water war narratives are back in media. So this is something that started initially in the 90s, then disappeared for a while, and then came back. So water war narratives are back. And there are these basically narratives of threats that's coming our way. Now, these academics, because they've been examining the conflict for ages, what they've noticed is that war is actually the exception here whenever you have a water-related tensions. There's also dubious causality. So are these conflicts caused by water really? Are there any water wars? This is something that we spoke also about in the first part of the talk. Is water causing conflict at all? There's also the issue of over-securitization. So water, when we talk about water wars, we are securitizing water. We're making it a narrative, a part of the political narrative. And that's our contribution as well to doing that. Now, war is generally, even if you think about war as a concept, so obviously there are people like Clausewitz that have said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Well, if you think about that, well, how often do you need to continue politics by other means? Well, not very often. So war is generally the exception. We, in international relations, study the exception, whereas cooperation is the norm. But how often do you read an article in the media about water cooperation? Well, almost never, probably, because that wouldn't make a nice title that would sell a newspaper or generate clicks. So, is water, in fact, a source of cooperation much more often than it is a source of conflict? This is another issue for you to consider from a very practical perspective. I'm not talking about theory, I'm talking about empirical cases. So, on that note, which is rather positive, I'll recap quickly the 5 practical considerations. So, first of all, think about risk management. Who manages risk? What kinds of factors do they consider when they manage risk? Second of all, think about diplomacy and how or why is water diplomacy something that you should consider, and is it something that's different from non-water diplomacy at all? The third one is human costs. Do we even know the human costs and who is bearing them? Because, well, to be honest, even if we have a great water disaster, it's perhaps none of us in the big cities that are going to suffer the most, because we have money in our pocket. So even in the worst of the worst situations, we can buy water. There's bottled water in the shop. So, you know, can all people go and do that? Not really. So, fourth, consider capitalism. Consider different types of corporate actors that come into play when you're dealing with managing water conflict. And finally, on a very positive note, bear in mind that water may very often be more than just a cause for conflict. It might be a fundamental source of cooperation. So that's everything that I had to say. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next session, Water Conflict 2.